We're going to change the front brake pads on the 2003 VW Passat. Let's chock the opposite wheel of the side of the car we're working on, apply our park and brake, and then let's find our jacking spot, which is right next to this little plastic tab. Let's just remove some of the weight at first, and then we'll go to break free the lug nuts. To break those lug nuts free, we do need to use these two special tools from the VW issued toolkit. Use the nut cover puller to remove the plastic nut covers, and then we are going to use the security lug tool to break free the one security lug nut per wheel. Once that security lug nut's broken free, go ahead and brake. When I say brake, just like a quarter turn on each of the lug nuts before we jack the car up higher and actually remove all of the lug nuts and ultimately the wheel itself. And we'll remove the retaining spring before moving on to the caliper guide pins. Now there is an end cap that needs to be removed with a flathead screwdriver to get access to the first caliper guide pin. So remove that end cap and use a hex driver to back out the caliper guide pin. Okay, we'll repeat the process for the lower guide pin. Again, pop the end cap off, back out the lower guide pin. Okay, before we remove the caliper, there's a couple wiring harnesses we have to disconnect. This is the ABS wheel speed sensor. Just back that out of its bracket. And then this little harness we disconnect that tells you when your brake pads are getting low. So disconnect the harness, and then let's take the other side and unclip it from its bracket. Okay, now we can start wiggling the caliper free. I don't take it all the way off. I just look for enough room to tether it to that upper control arm and then pop it off so it's not putting any weight on the brake line. Okay, this next step isn't completely necessary. I take this needle nose vice grips and I have some fuel line on the needle nose itself. I use it to clamp off the brake line as a precautionary measure. Okay, let's remove the rubber cap from the bleeder valve and let's get a box wrench placed on that bleeder valve. We're going to leave that in place so we can open and close it real quick. Be careful with this next step, guys. Brake fluid is poisonous, but take a length of fuel line, tie it in a loop, and just suck enough brake fluid into it to fill that loop with brake fluid. And we're going to take that fuel line, we're going to attach it to the bleeder valve that'll act as an airlock to prevent air from getting back into the caliper as we push the old fluid out. And again, just as a precautionary measure, I'm going to open the brake fluid reservoir cap before we go to push the fluid out of the caliper. So get your C-clamp in place, and as soon as you're ready to start compressing, just turn that box wrench to open up the bleeder valve, spin your C-clamp, you're going to see that brake fluid coming out. As soon as the C-clamp bottoms out, reach over, turn that box wrench again to close off the bleeder valve. Also notice I left the inside brake pad, the old one, in place. I like to leave that in there so the C-clamp has something to rest against as I compress the piston. Let's remove that needle nose vice grips. I should have cleaned the brakes as soon as I got the wheel off, but I forgot, so here goes, I'll do it now. Let's get some high temp brake lube on each point where that caliper mounting bracket makes contact with the pads, and we'll also get a little bit of lube on the piston itself. Okay, I'm going to untether the caliper and take the new inside pad and clip it into the piston. And then I'm going to take the new outside pad that actually doesn't go into the caliper initially, it just sits in the mounting bracket. And then you should be able to very easily place the caliper back onto the mounting bracket now that the piston's been pushed all the way back. Those guide pins we removed earlier, it's real important that the caliper can slide freely on those, so we're going to take more high temp brake grease, lube those things up before we reinstall them. Pop that plastic end cap back in place. Reinstall the second of the two guide pins. Let's clip the ABS wheel speed sensor harness back in its bracket. Let's take the new brake level warning sensor connector back in its bracket and connect it to the harness. Let's put our retaining spring back in place, and let's pop our wheel back on. Now I think you guys know the drill from here, so real quick, just twist in those lug nuts by hand. We're going to take a wrench and just snug them up a little bit while the car is still jacked up. We'll lower the car enough to get friction on the wheel. We'll take our breaker bar, torque those lug nuts down before we finally lower the car all the way, and replace our lug nut caps. So this job should not have lowered the level of the brake fluid in the reservoir at all, but we still want to top it off. Why? Because all of that brake fluid you saw squirting out before, that is going to get pulled into the caliper as we start to wear down the new pads. What I'm doing here is I'm pressing the brake a few times. This is pressurizing the system again. It's pressing those new pads against the disc. So the guy who taught me how to do brake jobs did not teach me to open the bleeder valve, and that's fine. I've probably done a dozen brake jobs without opening that valve. They've all turned out fine. But since then, I've become a believer in opening the bleeder valve, and I wanted to take a minute to talk about why. Incidentally, the method in this video is the method recommended in the Haynes manual. I know there's a lot of debate on YouTube and other forums about whether or not you have to bleed your brakes every time you do a brake job, and the Haynes manual does not call for bleeding your brakes. It actually just calls for using this method. So if I compress my brake piston, that fluid that's behind the piston has to go somewhere. If I don't open that bleeder valve, it's going to go through the brake line up into the ABS module. Supposedly that is very bad for the ABS module. You don't want that pressure going back up that way. Now if I clamp the brake line and open the bleeder valve and then compress the piston, that brake fluid that's behind the piston instead goes where? Through the bleeder line. So no pressure is getting pushed back up into the ABS module. Also, once you've compressed that piston and you go to close the bleeder valve, if there's any sucking back into the system, it's going to suck the brake fluid that you just pumped out, not air. That means you don't get any air into the system. That means you should not have to bleed your brake lines after you've done this job. So guys, happy wrenching. I hope this helps out and enjoy your new brakes.